Chapter 20, Section 1, Spain builds an American empire. So it might be getting a little redundant because we've already talked about Columbus, and there's also a separate video linked below that focuses solely on Columbus, but nonetheless, let's just review Christopher Columbus's voyages very quickly. So Columbus was born in what would be considered modern-day Italy in Genoa, and he had an idea that he could cross across the Pacific Ocean and get to Asia. And initially, various royal families denied his offer, including the Portuguese. Eventually, the Spanish crown, though, agreed to fund his initial trip with 3 ships, the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria, and they eventually made it to quote-unquote the New World. And I say quote-unquote because this is a very Eurocentric perspective, right? It's not like this world didn't exist. This world has been around just as long as Europe has been around. It's just that simply from the European perspective, it felt like they had discovered this land. When Columbus first got to the Americas, he believed that he had arrived in India, so he called the people there Los Indios, which means Indian. And when he first landed, he was greeted with open arms. The Indians and Columbus's crew, they traded items, and Columbus's crew was treated very well. They were fed, they were given housing, and whatnot. Columbus would claim this land as San Salvador, which means Holy Savior. A common mistake I've noticed among students is that when you Google San Salvador, usually what comes out is the capital of El Salvador, right? A small country in Central America. There's no relationship between this city of San Salvador and El Salvador in comparison to this territory that Columbus got to, which, as you can see in the map on the top right there, 1492, that's nowhere near El Salvador. That's in the Caribbean. The Spanish crown was rejoiced when Columbus returned with the good news of all these natural resources and this land that he quote-unquote discovered. And on his second voyage, he had much more better funding, and he came back with this time with 17 ships, including a lot of weapons. So this time, as opposed to discovery, he was going there for colonization, to take over the territory. Now, there's a lot more to be said about Christopher Columbus, but again, I go over this pretty extensively in the video that specifically focuses on whether or not Columbus was a good or bad historical figure. The link is below in the description. Please check it out. All right, moving on to Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian traveler who discovered, again, quote-unquote discovered, Rio de Janeiro. And he was a Portuguese explorer, and he is probably most well known for his name. His name, Amerigo, is what the German map maker, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, Martin Waldseemüller, used when he was making a map of the quote-unquote New World, and he knew from the writings of Vespucci that Vespucci had arrived in the Americas in the early 1500s, and therefore he credited that territory and land to being Amerigo, or America. This reminded me of a story about the city of, or the area of Aglo. The description of the story is linked below, and it has to do with this concept of paper towns. So again, details are on the link, but in a nutshell, what paper towns is about is that we create cities, or we create ideas. The idea of towns and cities, borders, all of these are man-made. Whether it's a border between Germany and France, Canada and the United States, Argentina and Brazil, these are man-made boundaries. So in the same way, I thought about this story when we're looking at Amerigo Vespucci, and it's amazing how history could have been totally different in regards to these names of America if the German map makers had in fact knew about Columbus. Then maybe instead of America, we would call that continent Columbia or Columbus or something like that, right? It's very interesting how small events change the big course of history. So Ferdinand Magellan and his crew were the first to circumnavigate, so the first to sail around the world. Although most of his crew, so 232 of them, passed away while making this voyage, the remaining 18 managed to make all the way around and circumnavigate the world. Magellan himself actually never made the trip when he died in what would be considered modern-day Philippines. So following Columbus's successful voyages, the Spanish were now interested in expanding the territories and going into what would be considered Central and South America today. And those who went to the Americas to conquer the territories were known as conquistadors. Throughout the 15 and 1600s, you can see how Spain has truly grown into a global empire. Now, one of the first major conquerings was of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, led by Montezuma II, was not in a good state. Montezuma II was pretty unpopular at the time. He had waged many wars with nearby groups which were willing to actually fight with the Spanish to defeat the Aztecs And despite coming up with an initial negotiation compromise, the Spanish decided to ambush the Aztecs in 1520 and take over all their territory. So 3 quick points about the conquistadors and the Aztecs. One is that they were able to take advantage of nearby tribes that wanted to fight against Montezuma. Two, a lot of the people in the Aztec territory got sick, so they didn't have to really be defeated because they were dying of diseases anyways. And finally, three, although the conquistadors were lesser in number, they had better technology and knew how to fight, so they were able to defeat the Aztecs even though they were outnumbered by quite a bit. Moving on to Francisco Pizarro.
Very simple. All we had to do was sail 5,000 miles from Spain to Panama, travel overland through the dense jungle, then build a whole new boat and sail down the coast to Peru. It only took us 2.5 years. Easy peasy, squeeze the lemon. And now we are going to meet some local Incas, see how they live, and find out about their magnificent culture. And steal all their gold. Pedro, please, don't mention the stealing the gold, okay?
Following Cortez's success, Francisco Pizarro took his conquistadors down south, what would be modern-day Peru, and they were able to take over the Incans. They kidnapped Incan leader Atahualpa, and they demanded a ransom. The Incans actually paid this ransom, but even though the Incans paid, they ended up killing the Incan leader anyways. The Incans were totally demoralized, losing their leader. A lot of them, like the Aztecs, were also getting sick by these diseases that the Europeans brought, and by 1533, the Incans in their capital, Cusco, had fell. So when the Spanish came and conquered, they had imposed Spanish culture, including their religion, their language. And one thing they did is they created a system where people are ranked by race. In a nutshell, you had 6 rankings, ranking from Peninsulares, Creoles, Mestizos, Mulattoes, to Native Americans to African slaves. So if you look at it in a chart, it kind of looks a little something like this. And you'll notice when we compare the right to the left, that there is a strong correlation between the whiter you are, the higher up in society you are, and the darker you are, the lower in society you are. And a question one could consider, and it's almost a rhetorical one, is, well, how does this encourage racism? Well, obviously it encourages racism in every shape or form, because clearly those who are either closer to Spain, so even among the people who are white, you have those who are peninsulares, those who are actually born in Spain, versus the Creoles, who are those who are not born in Spain, and those who are born in Spain are ranked higher. So they've created this social class system that discriminates against those with darker skin and provides privileges and advantages towards those who are lighter skinned and or connected to Spain. The Spanish, when conquering the Americas, had this system that they wanted to implement known as the Encomienda. And this, in theory, was a system that was meant to be for the Native Americans that would also help the Spaniards. However, in reality, the plans did not quite go as the Spanish wanted. So first of all, the idea was to Christianize them, quote-unquote civilize these Native Americans. But in reality, they were just pretty much forcing their beliefs on these Native Americans and killing them when they disagreed. Secondly, the idea was, yes, we will not pay the Native Americans, but in return, we'll allow the Indians to have food, they'll have nice shelter, and they'll live reasonable lives. But in reality, this was basically slavery. The Indians were overworked, many passed away in the process, and not only did they pass away, but a lot of them got diseases that they didn't have immunity built for. And ultimately, after a lot of protests coming, especially from the group of clergies, Encomienda was ended. Ironically, though, it was replaced by repartimiento, which was a system no better than the Encomienda. And in fact, this new system was pretty much just slavery. Right? There was really no intentions anymore of having this sort of win-win situation with the Native Americans and Spaniards, but instead just a forced system of labor, also known as slavery. The Spanish made sure when they conquered new territory to get rid of all sacred objects and made sure to ban any native rituals and try to replace it with, if you remember the 3 G's, there was gold, there's glory, and the third one, the God, right? The Christian God that they thought is worth spreading. So 3 quick points to think about when we look at the conquistadors. In a sense, they were tactical geniuses, right? When we look at just numbers, they were much, much lower than the native population. Despite the fact that many natives died from diseases, still the Spanish had to have much superior technology and had much better tactics when it came to fighting the Native Americans. So by the 16th century, Spain is truly a world power. We have Juan de Ponce de Leon get to what would be considered modern-day Florida. And now we have, if we look at a map here of Spain in the 16th century, You have Spain conquering basically all of the Americas. Because if you look at that territory north of what would be considered modern-day United States, a lot of that territory is inhabitable. So when you consider that, with the exception of Brazil, pretty much Spain owns all of the Americas. On a final note, the Portuguese stayed loyal to the Treaty of Tordesillas. And if you remember the Treaty of Tordesillas, there's that line drawn by the Pope. And if you look at how the properties are split between Portugal and Spain at the time, it looks a little something like this. And you got Portugal claiming that eastern part of what would be modern-day Brazil. And the Portuguese seem to be content with this distribution because, as you can see, they had plenty of trading routes with India, what would be considered modern-day Philippines, obviously all the way even to Nagasaki. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, blah, blah, blah. Have a nice day. Goodbye.